The Russia-Ukraine crisis has exploded and the market is in another period of volatility. Thursday saw the S&P 500 take an initial drop of 2.2% before ending higher by 1.1%. It looks like some investors have been scared off, but more opportunistic investors like myself have replaced them by taking advantage of buying opportunity. It can be helpful if investors are following the trend of scaremongering YouTubers promoting every market turn as the next market crash, but I can't complain too much given their views, as maybe they're just caving to the lowest common denominator. I tend to be more practical, so I'm going to outline a brief bit of Russian history, why the current events are no surprise, and the strategy I'm taking to navigate through it. Here we go. Democracy is a lovely sentiment, to think that public opinion matters and leaders can talk through their problems around a table and resolve them peacefully. Winston Churchill has often been quoted as saying that democracy is the worst form of government until you compare it to everything else. It's actually a misquote, and if you look at his fourth statement from the Parliament Bill, he was actually given a populist view, that the people should rule and their opinion should shape, guide and control the actions of leaders, who are their servants, not masters. Democracy only works with Democrats who care about public opinion, and there are plenty of tyrants in the East who retain a communist Cold War mindset where power is everything and the people should be subservient and suffering is acceptable if it is for the greater good of the state. The history of communism is full of such suffering, from people who starved during the time of Maoism, under the rule of the USSR, and still today under the rule of North Korea. Their lives come secondary to the personal benefits of their leaders who were focused on accumulating wealth and power for their own means. Russia, China, North Korea, their communist leaderships have been a growing threat to the West for decades. Western leaders are still scrambling to put together anything that can be considered a true threat, but decades of trying to push democracy down the throat of communist empires has ultimately resulted in having it spat in their faces. Historically, the leaders of these regions have tried to cover up the failures of communism, keeping the people ignorant of their suffering, suppressing public opinion so it cannot spread and become a threat. Mao claimed to be ignorant of the people starving during the time of his Great Leap Forward, during 1958 to 1962, as the issue was kept quiet. Evidence was destroyed, so we only have a broad estimate of around 40 to 80 million people who died from torture, starvation, prison labour and mass executions. Read into the Great Sparrow campaign if you can, because it's a good example of how devastating and idiotic his rule was. Now, Russian history, largely the USSR, is full of such arrogance, which continues to this day. 1986, the Chernobyl power plant exploded. The leadership tried to suppress information to the public about its severity and even ordered May Day parades to continue despite the risk to the population. It took 18 days before the public were officially informed, and of course many people died during the event. 1979 to 1989, the 10 years the USSR fought in Afghanistan, where they took heavy losses, 15,000 dead, thousands more injured, as they murdered millions of Afghan civilians and were overwhelmed by American military hardware against them. When news eventually broke out, Ukraine became the forefront of protests against the USSR. 1989, Solzhenitsyn's masterwork, The Gulag Archipelago, was finally published in Russia's monthly literary magazine, the Novy Mir. Despite being initially published in 1973 in France, it had been outlawed, so was smuggled house to house. It detailed the horrific treatment under the Soviets' forced labour camp system, with blame being pointed directly at Lenin, and became instrumental in challenging the legitimacy of the corrupt Soviet Union. The book, or audiobook, is available in English and offers a brutal but realistic memoir of his experiences. Or you could watch Lost in Siberia, a lesser known but equally brutal portrayal of the event. It was the accumulation of all this suffering brought on by the USSR that led to the state falling out of favour with the Baltic states, Eastern Europe and the Caucasus regions, and would eventually collapse by the end of 1991. This is why tyrannical leaders are threatened by the notion of a free press. They do not want the public to be informed or be able to form mass opinions against their governments, and they don't want Western ideals such as freedom and accountability to the people to spread. North Korea and China lack a free press, and the Russian government takes extraordinary lengths to censor theirs. Putin locks up or murders his opposition and uses propaganda and misinformation to justify his actions or blame his country's issues on the West. And his control of the media is how he can behave militarily as he does. When Russia took South Ossetia in 2008, it was in response to support from Bush to support a path for Georgia and Ukraine to become members of NATO. Putin claimed threats to Russian-speaking and passport-holding civilians in the region as justification in interfering militarily. As much as the USA, through Bush's administration, condemned the invasion of sovereign state with a democratically elected leadership, they failed to provide any military support in case they sparked a conflict with Russia. The lack of action of any real consequence to Russia meant ex-KGB Putin could get away with his Hitler mindset. As long as he could drum up justification and only took an inch, not a mile, he could expand his reign into Europe and restore the USSR. He was clear that the offer of NATO membership to any pre-USSR state would be considered a threat to Russia and would receive a similar response. It's no wonder that the same year Ukraine expressed concerns that the pro-Russian Crimea could be Putin's next target, and sure enough, 6 years later, this happened. Again, predictably, Putin used the pretext of protecting Russian citizens to justify his actions, and as before, no Western powers intervened as they didn't want to start a war with Russia. Mitt Romney stated a decade ago that America's alter ego, their idealistic threat, was Russia, and he was accused of being dated, having a Cold War mentality, with Obama gaining some points in the election debates for calling him on this.
This is to Russia. This is, without question, our number one geopolitical foe. They fight every cause for the world's worst actors. We go to the United Nations, and who is it that always stands up for the world's worst actors? It is always Russia, typically with China alongside.
The biggest geopolitical threat facing America, you said Russia, not Al-Qaeda. You said Russia. In the 1980s are now calling to ask for their foreign policy back.
That claim looks very different now. Russia has used the last decade to bulk up their military, growing Europe's reliance on them for gas and energy reserves, corrupting Western politicians and using digital technologies to spread information against the West. The situation in Ukraine is terrible, and I feel sorry for the people who are suffering, but the fact is none of this is surprising. It's a result of Putin's accumulation of power, his determination to restore the USSR, his pushback against democratic ideals, and the inaction of Western powers to hold him accountable. Putin has been storing up gold and financial reserves in preparation for sanctions, so they mount up to little more than finger-waving. He is determined eventually to take Ukraine whilst the world watches in condemnation, and we can only hope it's a long time before he takes anything else. But this isn't World War III. Putin has always been smart and sly, always taking just a little bit at a time, using lies and dirty tactics to grind his enemies down before striking. Taking Ukraine is one thing, but he won't be foolish enough to take on Europe, NATO, as that's a physical war against the Western world, and he won't have support from China, and he will lose. So the question is, how should investors navigate the current market volatility? What we're seeing is a war on ideology and a market dip caused by a lack of faith in the free economy to withstand the pressure. But, to paraphrase Warren Buffett when he spoke about the risk of the coronavirus, the American miracle, that is, the free market, has always prevailed and will do so again. The market is going in two directions. Gas and energy stocks, influenced by resources from Russia, are going to be impacted, and we're already seeing oil at record highs once again. Sanctions mean companies who have any business dealings with Russia are going to be hit with trouble, and the financial markets could also take a hit if Russia is locked out of the SWIFT banking system, which is a double-edged sword when it comes to the movement of world finance. The moves we've seen this week are out of panic, and yet again the market has proved to be resilient for investors who can tolerate short-term volatility and take advantage of opportunities. The lesson remains, in times of worldwide negativity, overcome fear in the market and take a realistic, critical view of your portfolio. Be critical of any companies that have business dealings with Russia or China. Oil and energy stocks might be on a high, but it might be best to take some profits off the table now rather than wait for another correction, as the rest of the world will resolve this situation either by negotiating with Russia or finding alternative resources, such as liquid natural gas or green energy. The biggest market-leading names that have been mostly affected by mass media attention are the ones most likely to be hit by a change in market sentiment, so companies such as Apple, Google and especially Tesla are not in my portfolio. I'm relying on undervalued companies with good fundamentals that are profitable within their domestic markets and are trading at a discount. You should have a buy list ready so you are prepared to pounce when the market moves in your favour. Buying amazing companies at a discount is the best way for an investor to take advantage of negative events. If you don't have a company you like, then just look at the S&P 500, which has beaten the market 17% returns for the last 5 years, averaging 10% returns since its creation. And it's always better to beat your bank interest. In a practical sense, I've just closed out my position with Linde, despite seeing value in their natural and CO2 gas production, but because of their links with Russia, I think they're too much of a risk. Instead, I've taken my position in Devon Energy, who are focused on oil and gas production onshore within the USA. They are profitable, they've shown continued growth quarter on quarter, and they trade at just 12 times earnings. They've just increased their dividend to $1 a share, which represents 7.59%, and I do love a dividend. I will eventually do a deep dive in the company as I continue my series of videos covering my portfolio. If you've made it this far, thank you. It takes a lot of effort to put together this information, and I hope it gives you some perspective on the situation and help you make some good long-term choices right now. So that's my take, and I will continue to cover my portfolio, and I will shortly be posting a new strategy video. So if you like what you've seen and you want to see more, consider subscribing so you don't miss out. If you have any thoughts, please comment below, let me know. Until next time.